Margaret Patterson had lived through 92 winters in her life, but none quite like this one. The small farm she had managed alone for the past 15 years, ever since her husband Thomas passed away, sat on the edge of the Alaskan wilderness, where the land stretched endlessly white and unforgiving. It was January, and the thermometer outside her wooden cabin read -71 degrees Celsius. The wind howled like a beast clawing at her windows, and through the frosted glass, she could barely make out the shapes of her 200 sheep huddled together in the barn. Margaret wrapped her worn wool shawl tighter around her shoulders and shuffled to the fireplace, her joints protesting with every step. She had arthritis, her eyesight was failing, and her hands trembled constantly, but she refused to leave this place. This farm was her life, her legacy, and the only connection she still had to Thomas. The radio crackled with static before the emergency broadcast cut through. A massive blizzard was approaching, expected to last 4 days with temperatures dropping to record lows. Wildlife services warned that predator activity would increase dramatically as desperate animals searched for food. Margaret's heart sank. She knew what that meant. The wolves. For weeks, she had heard their howls growing closer, more frequent, more numerous. Local rangers had confirmed that an unprecedented pack of nearly 7,000 wolves had been driven south by the extreme cold, their usual hunting grounds frozen over and barren. They were starving, desperate, and headed straight toward her property. Margaret's granddaughter Emily had called 3 times that week, begging her to evacuate to Anchorage. "Grandma, please, you can't stay there alone. What if something happens? What if the wolves come?" Margaret had dismissed her concerns each time. "I've survived worse, sweetheart. These sheep depend on me. I'm not abandoning them." But now, staring out at the darkening sky and hearing the distant, haunting howls carried on the wind, Margaret felt the first stirring of genuine fear. She wasn't afraid of dying. At 92, she had made peace with mortality. She was afraid of failing, of letting down the animals that trusted her, of breaking the promise she had made to Thomas on his deathbed that she would keep their farm alive. She pulled on her heavy boots, 3 layers of thermal clothing, and her late husband's oversized parka. The cold hit her like a physical blow when she opened the door. Her face instantly numbed, her breath crystallizing in the air before her eyes. She could barely see through the swirling snow as she made her way to the barn, each step a battle against the wind that threatened to knock her frail body to the ground. Inside the barn, the sheep pressed together for warmth, their eyes wide with instinctive anxiety. Margaret counted them carefully, her trembling fingers moving along each woolly back. All 200 were accounted for. She reinforced the barn doors with additional wooden planks and checked every possible entry point. The wolves were intelligent. They would look for weaknesses. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel, because here you'll find real stories of courage and survival that prove age is just a number when determination burns in your heart. As night fell, Margaret returned to her cabin and prepared for what she knew would be the longest 4 days of her life. She loaded her husband's old rifle, checked her ammunition supply, and laid out emergency flares along the windows. Then she sat in her rocking chair by the fire and waited. The howls began around midnight. At first, they were distant, scattered across the frozen landscape, but as the hours passed, they grew closer, louder, until they seemed to surround her property completely. Margaret stood at her window, rifle in hand, and saw them. Hundreds of glowing eyes reflected in the moonlight, gray and white forms moving like shadows through the snow. The wolves had arrived. The first attack came at dawn. Margaret had dozed off briefly in her chair when the terrified bleating of her sheep jolted her awake. She grabbed her rifle and stumbled outside into the brutal cold. The scene before her was like something from a nightmare. Dozens of wolves circled the barn, testing the doors, clawing at the walls, their hot breath creating clouds of steam in the freezing air. Margaret fired a warning shot into the sky. The crack of the rifle echoed across the snow, and the wolves scattered momentarily. But they didn't go far. They regrouped at the edge of the tree line, watching her with calculating intelligence. These weren't ordinary wolves driven by simple hunger. These were organized, patient, and desperate enough to be dangerous. Margaret's neighbor, Jack Morrison, was a former Marine who lived 3 miles down the road. She had his emergency number saved, and with frozen fingers, she managed to dial it on her old satellite phone. "Jack, they're here, hundreds of them. I need help." Jack's gruff voice came through immediately. "Margaret, I'm coming, but this storm is getting worse. It might take me an hour to get there. Can you hold out?" She looked at the wolves prowling around her property, their numbers seeming to multiply by the minute. "I don't have a choice." Jack's response was firm and reassuring. "You're the toughest person I know, Margaret. You fought off a bear 2 years ago with nothing but a frying pan. You can do this. Fire shots every 20 minutes to keep them nervous. I'm on my way." For the next hour, Margaret became a sentinel. She moved between the cabin and the barn, firing shots to disperse the wolves whenever they got too close, throwing lit flares to create walls of light they wouldn't cross. Her body screamed in protest. Her fingers were numb despite her thick gloves. Her lungs burned with each breath of the deadly cold air, and her legs threatened to give out beneath her. But she thought of Thomas, of the life they had built together, of every spring when newborn lambs took their first wobbly steps in the fields. She thought of Emily, who still had her grandmother's stubbornness, who would need to know that fighting for what you love is always worth it, no matter the odds. Jack arrived on his snowmobile, rifle strapped to his back and emergency supplies in tow. He was 73 himself, but military training never leaves a man. Together they reinforced the barn's defenses, created a perimeter of noisemakers and lights, and established a rotation schedule so one of them could rest while the other kept watch. "Margaret," Jack said as they worked, "most people your age are playing bingo in retirement homes. Here you are fighting wolves in minus 71 degrees. You're either crazy or the bravest woman in Alaska." Margaret managed a tired smile. "Maybe a bit of both." The wolves adapted quickly. By the second night, they had learned to time their approaches between the gunshots, testing different sections of the perimeter simultaneously to divide their defenders' attention. Margaret watched their tactics evolve and realized with growing concern that they were dealing with an intelligence she hadn't anticipated. The alpha wolf, a massive gray beast with a scarred muzzle, seemed to direct the others with specific howls and movements. This wasn't just survival instinct. This was strategy. Jack noticed it too. "They're learning from us, Margaret. We need to change our patterns." They began varying their defense routines, setting up false weak points rigged with noise traps, and using the unpredictability to their advantage. On the third day, the storm intensified to a level that made outside movement almost impossible. Visibility dropped to less than 3 feet, and the wind chill pushed the effective temperature to minus 80 degrees. Margaret's body was failing. She could barely grip her rifle. Her coughs had become constant, and Jack noticed her stumbling more frequently. "Margaret, we need to call for emergency evacuation. This is beyond what we can handle." She shook her head stubbornly. "No, we've come this far. Those sheep are alive because we didn't give up. I won't quit now." At 3 in the afternoon, disaster struck. A section of the barn's roof, weakened by the weight of accumulated ice and snow, partially collapsed. The sound sent the wolves into a frenzy. They sensed vulnerability and attacked en masse. Margaret and Jack fired shot after shot, but the wolves kept coming, driven mad by hunger and the scent of the terrified sheep. One wolf managed to squeeze through a gap created by the collapse. Margaret heard the screams of her animals and felt her heart shatter. Without thinking, driven by pure instinct and 9 decades of determination, she dropped her rifle, grabbed a metal fence post and charged into the barn. Inside, chaos reigned. The wolf had already killed 2 sheep and was going for a third. Margaret swung the fence post with strength she didn't know she still possessed, connecting with the wolf's side. The animal yelped and turned on her, its teeth bared, eyes wild. For a moment, Margaret stared into those predatory eyes and saw not evil, but desperation mirroring her own. They were both fighting for survival, both refusing to surrender. Jack's shot rang out, and the wolf fell. He pulled Margaret out of the barn, her face pale, her entire body shaking. "That was the stupidest, bravest thing I've ever seen," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. If you're watching this and feeling the same determination Margaret shows, type in the comments, "I never give up," so we can build a community of fighters who inspire each other. That night, as they worked to repair the barn's roof in the impossible cold, Margaret's hands finally gave out. She collapsed in the snow, unable to move. Jack carried her inside the cabin, her frail body weightless in his arms. "I failed them," she whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks. "No," Jack said firmly, building up the fire and wrapping her in every blanket he could find. "You've saved 198 sheep in conditions that would kill most people in minutes. You fought an army of wolves for 3 days straight at 92 years old. Margaret, you haven't failed anyone. You're a damn hero." His words broke through her despair, and she felt something shift inside her. This wasn't about perfection. This was about showing up, fighting hard, and refusing to quit even when your body screamed at you to stop. Dawn of the fourth day brought an eerie silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed into a glittering ice kingdom. The temperature had risen to -60 degrees, which felt almost warm by comparison. Margaret, despite Jack's protests, insisted on checking the barn. Her sheep were still there, huddled together, traumatized but alive. She counted them again, her heart heavy for the 2 they had lost, but grateful for the 198 who survived, because 2 elderly people refused to surrender. The wolves were still there, watching from the tree line, but their numbers had diminished. Many had moved on, following other prey. The remaining pack seemed less aggressive, as if they too were exhausted by the battle. Margaret stood in her doorway, wrapped in blankets, and stared at the alpha wolf. For a long moment they regarded each other across the snow. Then, as if reaching some unspoken understanding, the wolf turned and led his pack away into the forest. The siege was over. Jack stayed for another week, helping Margaret repair the barn completely and ensuring she had recovered enough to manage on her own. Before he left, he stood in her kitchen drinking coffee and shaking his head in wonder. "Margaret, what you did here will be talked about for generations. You should be proud." As she looked out at her sheep grazing in the snow, alive and safe, and felt Thomas's presence beside her. "I just did what needed to be done, same as anyone would." Jack laughed. "No, ma'am, same as Margaret Patterson would. There's a big difference." Emily arrived 2 days later with a documentary crew. News of the 92-year-old widow who fought 7,000 wolves in -71 degrees had spread across Alaska and beyond. Margaret was reluctant at first, uncomfortable with the attention, but Emily convinced her. "Grandma, people need to hear your story. They need to know that strength isn't about age or size. It's about heart. It's about refusing to give up on what matters." The interview was simple. Margaret sat in her rocking chair, surrounded by the life she and Thomas had built, and told her story without embellishment or drama. She spoke of fear and determination, of love for her animals, of the promise she kept, and of discovering that, even at 92, she was stronger than she ever imagined. If you watch this entire story, it proves you're someone who values real courage and perseverance. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can get to know you and know who really loves the stories on this channel. The video went viral within days, reaching millions of people across the globe. Messages poured in from around the world, people of all ages saying Margaret had inspired them to face their own wolves, whatever form those challenges took. A 70-year-old man in Texas wrote that he had decided to start the business he had always dreamed of. A teenager in New York said Margaret's story helped her stand up to bullying at school. A widow in London said she found the courage to start living again after years of grief. Margaret continued running her farm, though Jack and several other neighbors now checked on her daily and helped with the heavier work. Emily visited more frequently, bringing her children to learn from their great-grandmother's example. The sheep thrived, and the following spring brought a record number of healthy lambs. Margaret would sit on her porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, and feel deeply grateful, not just for surviving, but for the reminder that life isn't over until you decide it is, that courage doesn't diminish with age, and that the promises we keep, especially the hardest ones, define who we truly are. If this story touched your heart, hit the subscribe button to see more real stories of human courage that prove we're capable of more than we think. Give this video a like so others can find this inspiration, and share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to fight for what matters. Margaret's battle against impossible odds shows us that the size of our spirit matters far more than the size of our challenges.